Heading into the second half of the 18th century, Britain was tremendously powerful. With colonies on several continents and a booming economy at home, Britain was poised for a global ascendancy, the likes of which history had never seen. In this video, we'll see Britain at the apex of its glory with a world-spanning empire and a world-changing industrial revolution securing its place as the most powerful nation on Earth. The 7 Years' War and its consequences. The 7 Years' War continued to rage on, especially in the American colonies. A direct cause of the war had been disputes over British and French claims to American land, especially in the Great Lakes region. The French and their native allies initially got the better of the British, winning key victories at Monongahela in 1755 and Fort William Henry in 1757. But in 1758, British blockades and a smallpox epidemic among French Indian allies undermined their strength. Leaning on their own allies in the Iroquois Confederacy, Britain renewed its offensive and put France on the back foot. Their main goal was Quebec. In 1759, British forces sailed up the St. Lawrence River and laid siege to Quebec City, which surrendered on September 18, 1759. The capture of Montreal the following year effectively gave control of French Canada to the British. Things were going equally well for the British in India, with crushing victories over the French in Wandiwash and the capture of the French Indian capital of Pondicherry in 1761. In 1763, the exhausted French were forced to make peace. The Treaty of Paris recognized British gains in Canada, India, and elsewhere, securing England's position as the unchallenged European power in these regions. It was, however, a costly war, costing the British around £161 million. Britain racked up huge debt as it spent more on its military than it collected in taxes, and interest payments in the following years crippled the country's finances. We'll get on to the consequences the war had in America in a minute. But in India, the consequences were also significant. The defeat of the Nawab at Bengal at Plassey in 1757 worried other Indian rulers, including the Mughal emperor, who feared the danger posed by the unchecked British. In 1764, the Mughal emperor, along with several other Indian rulers, including the Nawab of Awadh, joined forces to oppose the newfound British supremacy. Despite outnumbering the invaders 2-1, the Mughal coalition was soundly defeated at the Battle of Buxar. The Mughal emperor was forced to make terms that handed the British control of taxes and revenues from the states of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. In one fell swoop, Britain seized a sizable chunk of India and had proven itself the dominant military power on the subcontinent. The American Revolution. The British would find new opposition in the Americas too after the 7 Years' War, but this did not go in their favor. By now, Britain's American colonies were thriving with a population approaching 2 million that was both armed and educated. After 1763, Parliament implemented a suite of taxes on sugar, molasses, tea, and more goods, as well as a stamp duty on all business exchanges to recoup the money spent on the 7 Years' War. Seeing the colonies as a rightful subject of the Crown and Parliament, England thought this was a perfectly reasonable decision. Not so for the American colonists, who found themselves facing a heavier tax burden with no effective political representation to oppose it. The politically active society of colonial America was soon abuzz with outrage. Town meetings began criticizing British rule, and pamphlets were circulated around the colonies questioning the justifications for Crown control of such distant land. Unrest grew with each new tax implemented through the 1760s. By 1770, tensions had reached a boiling point. On March 5, 1770, British troops fired upon a crowd of protesting colonists in Boston. in an act known as the Boston Massacre. Their deaths were a turning point, radicalizing colonists against the British and making a peaceful solution almost impossible. In 1773, the British passed the Tea Act to grant the East India Company a monopoly of the tea trade, which harmed American tea merchants. In response, a group of colonists boarded English ships in Boston Harbor and dumped the tea into the water. The British did not appreciate this Boston Tea Party and ordered a massive crackdown on unrest in the Massachusetts colony. Arbitrary detention, suspension of the law, the shutting of the Boston Harbor, and more outrages proved too much for the colonists. In September 1774, American representatives gathered at the First Continental Congress to declare the formation of a militia and boycott of all British goods. King George III considered this open rebellion. In April 1775, he sent his troops to arrest the rebel leaders in Lexington and Concord. On April 19th, the colonial militia and British troops opened fire. The shots heard around the world marked the start of the American War of Independence. The British faced humiliating defeats at the hands of the colonists at Bunker Hill in June and at Boston in March 1776. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress declared its full independence from Britain, and another bold victory by the colonists at the Battle of Trenton on Christmas 1776 under George Washington painted a dire picture for the British. The entry of France into the war in 1777 tipped the balance even further in the colonists' favor. The British were able to secure victories in the American South in 1779 and 1780, but the more valuable northern colonies continued to be an area for British defeat. By September 1781, the last British forces under General Cornwallis were besieged in Yorktown by Washington and his French allies. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis offered his surrender. Another Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, formally recognizing the independence of the United States. The irony of the American Revolution is that it was a repetition of the issues that had led to the English Civil War. An overbearing government that refused to listen to its people and imposed taxes without its consent shouldn't be surprised when people turn against it. It was, at this point, a British tradition. It marks the end of what historians label the First British Empire. Although it still held Canada, and Britain's imperial focus now shifted towards South Asia and then Africa. The American Revolution was a landmark event in world history. But for England, the downturn in morale and loss of revenue from the colonies was a relatively minor interruption in the grand scheme of things. Britain's growing empire in India and Africa offered alternative sources of income that the British government expected would make up for the loss of the American colonies in time. The sun had set on the First British Empire, but it had only just begun to rise on the Second. Into the 19th century. After a lapse in confidence in the government through the 1780s, Britain shook off the negative consequences of the Revolution with the steady leadership of William Pitt, or Pitt the Younger, who helms the government for almost 20 years. What Pitt lacked in charisma, he made up for in a sharp administrative mind and a steady dedication of public service. As Prime Minister, he repaired the nation's dismal finances through new taxes and ruthless cuts to needless expenditure. He was similarly ruthless in the rooting out of political enemies within Britain, especially in the wake of the French Revolution. Pitt's government also presided over the response to the Irish Rebellion in 1798 and formulated the 1801 Act of Union to tighten control of Ireland. The act also officially renamed the country from Great Britain to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The Irish Rebellion had been inspired by the French Revolution of 1789. The consequences of the French Revolution continued to be felt for years, as Britain was drawn into a series of wars with France, first with its revolutionary government, and then the man who rose to supplant them, Napoleon. Britain defeated Napoleon while he was still serving the revolutionary government in Egypt, a victory that began over a century of English colonial influence in the country and led to them taking an interest in, then outright taking, the archaeological remains of ancient Egypt. After Napoleon became emperor, his authoritarian power and military genius allowed him to dominate European affairs for a decade, prompting Europe to join together in a series of coalitions to oppose him. With most of Britain now literate and newspapers in wide circulation, the people of Britain could follow the story of Napoleon as it unfolded in real time. With such tremendous military success, Britain feared that Napoleon might invade. Multiple forts were built along the southern coast, although they were never needed. This new awareness of world affairs was grounds for myth-making too. Lord Admiral Horatio Nelson's victory over the French fleet at Trafalgar in October 1805 joined Hastings and Agincourt as one of the great battles of English history. And Nelson's death turned him into a martyr hero, the likes of which England had not seen outside of saints. Similar adoration fell upon the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, who led the coalition forces to a final victory over Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815. Napoleon's defeat brought in a new age of European politics. Warfare had dominated European affairs for centuries, but the scale of the slaughter now possible with new technology was unprecedented. With social status and prosperity now won through trade with the world rather than by fighting the rest of Europe, Britain was keen to keep European affairs in order. The Concert of Europe was the informal arrangement of mutual respect for territory and a focus on maintaining a balance of power on the continent that avoided major wars for the rest of the 19th century. Even Britain's ancient animosity with the French was set aside in hopes of long-term peace. The Industrial Revolution. But war and politics would not change life in Britain nearly as much as technology would. In 1769, Scottish inventor James Watt filed a patent for a functional steam engine, which used coal fire to produce pressurized steam to power an engine that had seemingly limitless applications in industry and transportation. Watt's engine opened up a new wave of innovation, from driving factory machinery to powering ships, from the invention of the steam train to more effective water pumps for mining and agriculture. The Industrial Revolution had arrived. A few factors allowed the Industrial Revolution to happen in England. Ready access to raw materials like coal and iron, the availability of capital for investment in expensive machinery thanks to its sophisticated financial system, a limited government that left plenty of room for private innovation to keep powering the revolution, and an abundance of labor thanks to the population explosion brought on by the agricultural revolution of the 17th and early 18th century all played their role. The empire helped provide the capital for the revolution, but the labor and resources that powered it were almost entirely British. The Industrial Revolution, combined with the earlier Agricultural Revolution, shifted Britain from a primarily rural society to a primarily urban society. High agricultural yields meant a smaller number of farmers could feed a large non-agricultural population. People flocked to the cities to find work in new factories, or to the mining regions like Northern England and South Wales, where there was always work for more miners. The beating heart of this revolution was powered by coal. England had been using coal for fuel since the medieval period, but the invention of steam power turned it into one of the most important resources on the planet. Mining coal was back-breaking work, where miners toiled for long hours in the dark underground. Miners faced terrible risks from gas leaks and mine collapses, and even those who avoided such immediate dangers faced long-term health consequences from inhaling coal dust for years on end. Even children worked in the mines, often running messages or supplies between miners or operating the doors to allow minecarts through the underground tracks. Despite how tough the work was, though, there was never a shortage of miners. People flocked to North England and South Wales to seek the steady work the mines promised. These coal communities were fertile grounds for social reformers and socialists to find support, with both Wales and the North becoming strongholds for left-wing and socialist movements on the backs of the mining communities. The shift to urban life brought with it its own host of problems. Disease, crime, and cramped living in the cities, which were often dirty and clouded with smoke from thriving industry, are the dominant images of industrial-era city life. While city life certainly had its problems, expressed so vividly in the work of Charles Dickens and countless other contemporaries, people moved to the city because the life it offered was ultimately better. Yes, hours were long and living conditions could be grim, but this was true of rural life as well. The cities simply offered more opportunities, and better ones at that in terms of income, than clinging to rural life. Much like in the years after the Black Death, the Industrial Revolution did not lead to a decline in people's quality of life in real terms, but rather a rise in their expectations. A wealthier, more literate, better educated population of the world's economic and technological powerhouse demanded more from their lives than ever before. More political power for the masses, greater protections as workers, and demands for a fairer share of the economic bounty were commonplace. The Chartist movement of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s was the most famous expression of this. It demanded universal male suffrage and various parliamentary reforms to allow regular people to serve as MPs rather than just the landed elite. While the Chartist movement failed, largely thanks to the fallout from a violent uprising in South Wales in 1839 that undermined its image with regular people, its existence represented a new politically conscious and politically active Britain produced by and in reaction to the Industrial Revolution. The Victorian Age. Through these events, you'll have noticed the relative absence of the monarchy. With the Restoration and Glorious Revolution bringing heavy limits on royal power, the kings and queens of England had been shrinking in importance for a while. The earlier Hanover kings of George I and II were a far cry from the Plantagenets or Tudors in how active they were in political events. George III similarly exercised less power over domestic affairs, although his collapse into insanity towards the end of his reign didn't help matters. George IV, an unpopular and unpleasant man whose death in 1830 was met with little mourning, wasn't much better. Even the defeat of Napoleon during his reign had practically nothing to do with him. But after the brief reign of the competent but unremarkable William IV, Britain received one of its most legendary monarchs, in Queen Victoria. Compared to her much older predecessors, Victoria's influence on affairs in England was minimal. The role of the monarch was now one of a figurehead. Victoria correctly realized that the monarchy needed to evolve. In an age of rapid societal change, where Britain commanded the largest empire in the world and new technology was coming faster than ever, Victoria served as a symbol of stability and sentimental attachment over her long 63-year reign. The Victorian Age was Britain at the apex of its power. Its empire reached its greatest extent, its economy and industrial lead over its rivals was at its strongest, and Britain had a unique confidence in its place as the supreme nation on Earth. Technological innovation continued to push the bounds of possibility. Isambard Kingdom Brunel pioneered the massive expansion of Britain's rail industry and developed advanced steamships to connect the world more quickly and more efficiently than ever before. Britain was the scientific capital of the world. From smallpox vaccines to identifying cholera to discovering dinosaurs. British scientists led the world in their discoveries. Standing tall among them was Charles Darwin. Darwin's voyages aboard the HMS Beagle allowed him to develop the theory of evolution by natural selection. His groundbreaking book on the origin of species marked a revolution in scientific thought and the understanding of life on Earth, while posing a serious challenge to the religious explanation of creation. Britain and the Empire. All of this occurred in the context of Britain's globe-spanning empire, which, at its peak, covered a quarter of the world's landmass and a similar share of its population. It has been said that the British conquered the world almost accidentally. It is true that Britain never set out with some detailed plan for world conquest. Conquests often came piecemeal, achieved over many decades with no preconceived plan. But they were encouraged by an imperialist attitude that Britain had adopted. Britain came to see itself as divinely ordained, with a special responsibility to spread civilization to the rest of the world. Trade and conquest were unavoidable realities, sure, but to the average Briton, the empire's existence was justified as a moral project, whether through stamping out paganism or the slave trade, creating new Christian communities or spreading liberal ideas. Most Britons justified the empire as a project that uplifted its subjects, whether they wanted it or not. Of course, non-Britons didn't always feel that way, but the relatively small number of non-Britons within Britain, their minimal political representation, and a lack of interest in anything they had to say that might counter the dominant imperial propaganda meant their feelings were unheard. The idea that the empire was one giant Christian mission secured a lot of support for religious circles, even if those religious people had things to say about the profit-seeking and abuses of imperial rule. Tales of famous missionaries like David Livingstone were known to everyone in Victorian society, and tens of thousands of other missionaries went to all corners of the empire and beyond. Late 19th century Britain was a golden age for missionary work, as both Anglican and nonconformist religious communities rallied to the imperial cause on religious grounds. An eager religious press at home popularized the travels of missionaries, while the churches, which were still a major center of social life for the English people, preached their accomplishments at services and Sunday schools, hoping to inspire new generations of missionaries to contour the empire. But of course, empires weren't built on faith alone. Settlers were needed to push the empire further. Canada was a favorite for English settlers, with Australia and New Zealand also becoming popular from the early 19th century. The relatively small native populations there had either already been removed or were easily overpowered to clear the way for settlers. Between 1815 and 1914, an estimated 10 million emigrated from Britain and Ireland, primarily to destinations within the empire or to the United States. But settlement generally wasn't the rule in India, where British administrators and soldiers never numbered more than 100,000 at any one time. British power was mostly achieved through the annexation or subjugation of smaller Indian kingdoms and princedoms that fell at a steady rate after 1757. With the defeat of the Sikh Empire in 1849, Britain seized control of virtually every inch of the Indian subcontinent. Similarly, in Africa, British imperialism in the age of the Second Empire was more focused on resource extraction, missionary work, and moral crusading than implanting new settler colonies, with the notable exception of South Africa. Britain abolished the slave trade in 1804 thanks to an impressive public morality campaign, and during the 19th century was a zealous opponent of slavery. The Royal Navy hunted down slavers in the Atlantic, and Britain used its diplomatic might to force slavery abolition in places like the Ottoman Empire. Unfortunately for Africa, where the British had once encouraged slavery, they now used it as justification to intervene on the continent. The scramble for Africa of the late 19th century between Britain and other European powers was framed as a Christian moral crusade where slavery, along with paganism, savagery, cannibalism, were used to justify the conquest and control of large chunks of the continent. Gathering storm. The 19th century was undoubtedly a British century, but problems were gathering that would pose challenges in the 20th. Victoria's death in January 1901 was an ominous beginning to a century that would bring even more change to Britain. The meteoric rise of Germany following its unification in 1871 challenged British industrial and military supremacy in Europe and destabilized the delicate balance that had existed there since 1815. There were hints of trouble farther afield, with nationalist movements beginning to take root in India, Egypt, and elsewhere that threatened Britain's imperial control. But there were problems closer to home, too. The Boer War between 1899 and 1902 pitted the British against the Dutch Boers of South Africa, who opposed British rule. Despite being the world's most powerful empire, Britain struggled with these disorganized farmers, and a big reason for that was the quality of its troops. A huge percentage of the men who tried to enlist had to be turned away because they were sick, disabled, or malnourished to the point that they just couldn't serve. At least 40% of the recruits during the war had to be denied on health grounds, and in some towns this percentage was much higher. It was an unpopular war abroad, with Britain being harshly criticized in Europe and the US for the brutal scorched earth methods they employed. The British use of concentration camps where thousands of Boer civilians died from disease also reflected badly. Although Britain won the Boer War, the difficulty it had in doing so and the hit it took to its image of strengthened morality was significant. It was the Boer War that provided the catalyst for a crop of new laws to address poverty when a Liberal government came in 1906. The liberal social reforms of the next few years created the modern British welfare state and changed the role of government in British life. From 1906, free school meals and medical checks were implemented for schools, hoping to address the dismal state of health revealed by the Boer War recruits. In 1908, the Old Age Pensions Act was passed to help the elderly, while the sick and unemployed were helped with the National Insurance Act of 1911, which provided unemployment benefits and a range of other provisions. Other reforms addressed things like working conditions and union rights. The Boer War also raised another concerning question. If Britain struggled to defeat a bunch of farmers, how would it fare against a truly modern army? In a few short years, they would find out. If you'd like to help us keep creating and get early access to our videos, behind-the-scenes content, and other perks, consider becoming a member right here on YouTube or joining us on Patreon. Every bit of support helps. And as always, thank you so much for watching.